Invest Africa, proudly brought to you by KPMG.
Hello and welcome to Invest Africa. I'm Nozi Pombanjwa. Now, just this week, both the World Bank and the IMF reported that Sub-Saharan African economies appear to be losing their steam. The banks are pointing to the collapse of global commodity prices, but they're also pointing to domestic political and economic pressures. Given this environment, can South Africa sustain its investment attractiveness, of course, in the context of these political and economic headwinds? To help me answer some of these questions, I'm joined by the CEO of the South African Chamber of Commerce, Mukoki. I'm joined by Economist at KPMG South Africa, Lullu Krugel, and of course by Duke Corporate Education's Regional Managing Director responsible for Africa, Sharmla Chetty. Thank you for making the time to join us this evening. Lullu, let's just start off with you. We've seen, obviously, the Bretton Woods institutions coming and giving their voice and pointing to domestic political as well as economic pressures. But what is the internal perspective? Would you concur with some of the views that they've put out, or would you have a different view that would give the explanation for why we're seeing such subdued outlooks for South Africa's growth?
Well, definitely political factors, economic factors internally does contribute to what we're seeing in South Africa at the moment, yes. But there are also certain external factors that's playing a role. We can't ignore the role that the slowdown of the growth, specifically in the resource part of the Chinese economy and resource demands has had. And also the rest of Africa. We started to trade more with the rest of Africa, so that's also impacting us to some extent. So yes, global demand being under pressure is also having an impact. But there is a fair bit of it that unfortunately we can bring back home to some things that we're not doing 100% right at the moment.
All right, so a couple of own goals that we probably need to analyze. Sharma, let me bring you into the conversation because you work with CEOs across the continent every day and in South Africa in particular. And we've seen the numbers. I think the IMF number was 0.7% growth being forecast, down from 0.6%. What are CEOs saying about the current environment that they find themselves in?
I think, very much alluding to, what has already been said. They are really nervous. We are a global community. The world is watching us. They are seeing things around corruption, the political context, and those issues. And around ethical leadership is playing a key role in terms of how do we actually embed this as part of the organization? How does it actually become the fabric of who we are as an organization as well? So these things are keeping CEOs awake at night. Yes, there are external environment. Yes, there are, the commodity issues that are facing the world as well. But more importantly, what are the behaviors do we need to embed as part of the larger ecosystem?
Right. So you raise a very important point because it will lead us into the conversation around resilience. So how do you build resilience and to survive? And is ethical leadership one of those things? We'll get to that point. But let's get to the experience on the ground. The members of the South African Chamber of Commerce possibly have the closest feeling of what it's like to operate in this political environment. What are you hearing, Alan, about the environment, the political pressure, as well as the subdued economic space we're in?
I think what you seem to be hearing is fear, anxiety, that those two tend to go hand in hand together. People are uncertain about what the future holds, and I think that there is, in a sense, a vacuum in leadership. And I don't mean by saying that there are no people who are in leadership positions, but I'm saying that there's a vacuum in respect of where to from here. In other words, everyone is accusing everybody of something that's wrong that's happened, but it doesn't look like someone is stepping forward to say, well, if the ship is sinking or there's an appearance that it is, I'm the person who's stepping forward and I'm going to necessarily take us out of here to some kind of place where it's safe for everybody else. And I think that is a big area of a huge gap at this point in time.
Who should be at the helm, Alan? Because I think there's always the tendency to say that, government as the policy formulator and implementer should be leading. But increasingly, we've seen business leaders collaborating much more closely with government. Are we clear who's responsible for redirecting this sinking ship, if I could call it that?
I think it starts before that particular question. It has to start, in my view, from a point of view that says, Are we as society, whether we're business, whether we're communities, whether we're government, having a conversation which is the same? In other words, is there a social dialogue of a common South African citizenship or corporate citizenship for that matter? We disagree too much with each other. Sometimes we disagree about things that don't necessarily matter that much to other people outside, you know? But we make
For
them
example?
Well, there are many issues. For instance, if you look at the number of instances where South Africans themselves have taken their own government to court, for instance, to the Constitutional Court, and have received a particular precedent, we've tended to interpret that more as a negative something, as opposed to looking at it and say, wait a minute, 300 years from now, we are going to be in a much more better place because we now have a precedent that we didn't have before. We didn't know before the extent to which there were always these different interpretations, but the extent to which the PP's findings are binding, if not challenged before a court of law. No one actually knew that. We have hindsight now. We can say all sorts of things. But for the first time, we now know that there is a governance system where one side of government collapses, we can go somewhere. And for us as citizens, this is a very important development. Why? Because you don't pay to take your cases to the PP. She does the investigations for you for free. So we've now made this thing of jurisdiction, of tribunal management to be cheaper. And it's one positive aspect of what actually has arisen out of this thing. And I think that it's something that we should look at in a sense that is more positive, but we tend to play with it more as, oh, it's so bad, it's so negative, look how we don't know what we're doing, and look at the things that are happening that are bad in South Africa. And that particular aspect is one of the things that we do need to have a social dialogue on.
So it's an interesting point of view because, Lulu, if we take a look at how just the Rand reacted on the back of the Constitutional Court ruling, we saw the Rand strengthen. And there were lots of questions about, well, what are investors actually perceiving this to be? And maybe aligned to Alan's argument that this is a strengthening of a young democracy. Do investors necessarily see South Africa in the same lens that we as the populace tend to see the country?
Well, I think one of the things that surprised me, for example, is to see some of the areas where investors think we're strong. If we look at the global competitiveness indices or index, we're doing a lot better than we did a couple of years ago. For about 12 years, we dropped in the rankings, and then last year we improved 7 places. And one of the areas where investors say, listen, we have a lot of trust in South Africa, is in our institutions, is in our legal institutions, and is in the ability of our financial and legal institutions to protect their rights as investors. So that's definitely one of the areas where investors are saying, when we come and do business here, we know these institutions in place. We know the financial institutions, the audit institutions, the regulators that's in place is actually pretty strong. So we shouldn't disregard that, and I tend to agree with what Alan has said. You know, I think there's a healthy dialogue that's taking place, something that we forget for many years. If we look back more than 20 years ago, these kinds of things wouldn't have been in the open, it wouldn't have been there. And it doesn't make it right, but it does mean that there's debate that's going on, and that things are out there in the open, and we as citizens are aware of what's happening.
So maybe let's run with this idea, Sharmla, of a social dialogue and a stronger dialogue and more intense and more a deeper dialogue that has more players and more voices in it. And we're putting the institutions as one of the agenda items for discussion. But what do you think we also need to address as the country, as if we are to move forward together as government and business?
I think the core skills, you know, if you're looking at, you know, alluding to what Alan is talking about here, it's the active stakeholder, right? And meaning that your stakeholders are becoming quite broader than you initially thought about. That, you know, your society is playing an active role. You see many others, you know, religious groups playing a role in terms of shaping the dialogue. So how do you actually get the collective involved in shaping the conversation, and not thinking that it is government or corporate, but the collective? What does the collective really look like in shaping the dialogue? And then together co-creating and thinking about what the future would look like, and actually addressing the things that you feel uncomfortable with. Talking about corruption quite openly, because it is the key topic at the moment. It's the key theme at the moment. So how do you get the dialogue embedded in part of a broader, you know, ecosystem? And what does it really mean?
So let's put corruption on this program as well. And I'm wanting to get a better understanding, Alan, of, as an investor, what do I want to see business and government leaders engaging on? If we're talking openly about corruption, that's a positive sign. But if we're going to really shift the dial in terms of the risk premium that is associated with investing into South Africa, what needs to change fundamentally?
Well, the first thing that needs to change, of course, is how we ourselves articulate our own problems as South Africans. That's a very fundamental area, because, you know, you can't expect international investors to have a different narrative of what you are doing when you yourself are setting fire to your own house. You have a fight with your sister and your brother at home because your sister and brother are not running the place correctly. You get rid of them, but you don't burn down the house. Because in the final analysis, this is the message that we send as leading people who are leading our own organizations to say, even to some of our members, sometimes they get angry. Sometimes they say, but your statements are not strong enough. I say, but yesterday I was talking to the Wall Street Journal. What exactly did you want me to do? You want me to tell international investors that this place is so bad, so they withdraw their investment, so that your own businesses are now going to suffer. So we need to then be able to separate the issues of the hype from the reality, because we come back to your question that you're raising. It's a very important question. The issue is institutional strength. In other words, things are going to happen. We're going to take each other to court. As long as I know, in the final analysis as an investor, if I have a dispute with you or a politician in your country, when I go to a tribunal, that tribunal is going to be independent, fearless, and my case is going to be entertained by someone who is absolutely not biased, who is not actually afraid of a politician. And our institutions are beginning to show that very, very clearly, in a way that's very, very vibrant, in a way that's very, very public. You've got the public protector, there's a woman there who herself has claimed that she comes from exactly the same political formation, but is not afraid to take decisions that are unpopular with the very same political organization which is so powerful. You've got the courts, and many of these people who sit in that particular courts, and people actually forget, they themselves are former activists politically. They themselves are former human rights lawyers, but they are sitting in that court making really, really serious decisions in terms that show that they are very, very independent. And that institutional framework is what we look at in respect of, okay, maybe you've got problems, but I know in a case where there's a dispute, I can go somewhere where it's safe and I can get my issues resolved.
So on that note, we're going to take a short break, but interesting insights, because it helps us to better understand the fracas that we've seen in Parliament, the shots that political parties throw at each other, and maybe better understanding these as a richer and a deeper democracy, which bodes well for the investment case in South Africa. Am I pushing it, or am I on the money? Let's find out after the break. Welcome back to Invest Africa. We're looking at the investment case for South Africa given the context of political and economic headwinds. Still with me in the Johannesburg studio, the CEO of the South African Chamber of Commerce, Alan Mukoki, economist at KPMG South Africa, Lullu Krugel, and Duke Corporate Education's Regional Managing Director responsible for Africa, Sharmla Chetty. Sharmla, I want to come back to pick up the conversation with you. If we take what the World Bank is saying and what the IMF is saying, I think also reinforced by Lullu, is that we're likely going to see lower commodity prices for still some time now. If we look at the trajectory of the oil price, it's expected to still be lower for a little bit longer. So there needs to be a survival game plan that needs to come to the fore. Now, you've mentioned ethical leadership as one of the ways to ensure that we stay above the fray. What else is going to make sure that those who do survive the downturn do so strongly? Outside of leadership, what are you advising your clients on what to focus on?
So I think one of the key enablers, in terms of, when things go wrong, people spend a lot of time about the problem. How do you actually become part of the solution? How do you actually become proactive? Meaning that it is not one person's fault or the other, because we spend a lot of time as a country blaming, but we don't see it as an opportunity in terms of rewiring ourselves and reorientating ourselves into new ideas, new thinking processes, and so forth. So the types of skills that one would have, or the opportunities, is looking for opportunities where everybody else can't see. So meaning that if you're wanting to expand into a new market, are you thinking about cultural adaptability? Are you actually upskilling your workforce right now where you're seeing problems and you're seeing areas for improvement, and now how are you taking accountability to that? Another thing is around entrepreneurial mindset, innovative thinking, design thinking. These are skills that you can actually create for now, for the future, or create these skills now for giving people the opportunity to think about what else you can do. Because I think the skill we're having right now is looking at the paper every single day and looking at the same problems, but and analyzing it instead of actually reframing these problems into solutions.
I look at the environment and I would think this is the time where our policymakers need to be agile and flexible and rethink some of the hard and fast rules to ensure that investing into South Africa is even easier. How do we go about doing that?
Well, absolutely. I can't agree with you more. Alan mentioned something earlier as well, to say that we must be very careful about the message that we send and what we reinforce as business and as government and as private citizens in South Africa. It's about keeping that belief in ourselves, in our own business as well, if we are in the business industry. But yes, very importantly, as you say, we have, and this is a conversation that's been had 1,000 times in South Africa, is we have policies in place. We have so many, the basics are good, the fundamentals are there. It's about implementation. And perhaps now even more than before, there's been some interesting moves that's been made around the SEZs, around tax incentives, around some initiatives that the DTI has put into place. It's perhaps time to push those things even harder, to go out there and literally go shopping and selling South Africa to the rest of the world. Everything is there. I just think even more than it ever has been the case, it's important to implement those basic policies that we have, and that's actually pretty good.
It's just unfortunate that Ambassador Jaffa couldn't join us, but he's been newly appointed as the head of Invest SA, which of course is the entity that's been set up as a one-stop shop to do exactly that. And for me, the question then becomes, how do you differentiate yourself amongst other emerging markets who are also under pressure? Because if we look at global monetary policy, emerging markets are just not the most attractive investment destination now. What is the South African secret ingredient?
Yeah. I think what we have is, if we compare ourselves, for example, to some of our counterparts, you mentioned in developing markets not being a very favorable destination at the moment. And to be quite frankly, if you think about the BRICS, the only place that looks attractive at the moment is the eye in the BRICS.
Yes.
And it's interesting, I think we can actually take some lessons from India there. And what excites me is that our own Department of Trade and Industry is actually engaging as well with their counterparts in India. If you look at how they went about during Davos, how strongly they came out, how clear they were about the messaging that they took to the market there. Some people actually compared it to the South African 1995 delegation, said it was that same energy that was there. So it's important that we've been able to punch above our weight in the past, and a lot of the things that we have to offer in terms of our infrastructure strengths, we've already spoken about the institutions. There's a lot of things that's actually, and I want to say it in inverted commas because it's not always a good thing, but first world, if I could put it that way. And that actually provides quite a bit of support for investors looking at
and differentiation. But maybe one thing, Ellen, let me be a devil's advocate here, that we seem to be losing steam around is the National Development Plan. I mean, we spoke for quite some time about how do we move into implementation, but one of the big things that we're aware about is the GDP growth that we have to hit in order to make this plan feasible. And as the numbers come out, increasingly we are falling away from this 5%. So where do we put this plan now? Is this still the blueprint that business should be following?
Well, yes, I think that there's, if you look at the NDP, there's nothing wrong with it as a plan, and as Lullu is saying, and Sharmla, is you need to have an execution capability as well. In other words, it's all very well to say I've got a plan, but where's the execution going to come from? And I think that South Africa needs to invest a lot more in that area of execution. In other words, how do we execute the plans that come from government? Government, for instance, will have great plans. They've got a little bit of capital, But in a number of cases, they don't necessarily themselves have skills, neither do they own businesses, neither do they take decisions about, I'm going to put capital there and I'm expecting X of a return. So the alignment needs to happen at this point in time. You've got the DFIs themselves. I was in a meeting just the other day with the Minister of Finance, and one of the points that I was making when he was meeting with business was, your very same DFIs need to be aligned to the purpose. In other words, you can't be having the same criteria, very, very stringent, that commercial banks who are representing private capital have in respect of making investments. There should be investments that you're prepared to make. In other words, your risk parameter, and I'm not saying that these things must be badly run and necessarily go make huge losses, because that's not going to be good. But in the final analysis, there's a very clear need to look much more deeper into whether the criteria of investment that they use is in fact appropriate for the times in which we live right now, particularly to drive a lot of the innovative type ideas and a lot of the schemes that are going to enable us to expand, because there's huge business here in South Africa. You don't even have to go to Zambia or any other place. You've got swathes and swathes of an unexplained and unavailable and absent market, which is this new black middle class. And I think that everything needs to be done. 10 years ago, if you walked into an Edgar's shop, the cashier counter, you found that there were only white people there. Today, it's just black everything. And that's telling us that the data is actually shifting. And in fact, there's a market that can be developed in South Africa in a way that is very, very aggressive and much more quicker, because people are here, they're available, give them jobs, give them opportunities so that they become the new markets. And there are markets around us as well. Mozambique, Zambia, all these particular places are actually open for business. But we also need to be able to teach and to inform and to educate our business people in South Africa, because that's one of the key ideas. A lot of our own members don't know anything about what's happening in Zambia. We met the Minister for Trade, Commerce and Industry from Zambia when we put together the South Africa-Zambia Business Council just a few months ago. And one of the things that she said, did you know that Zambia has had 6 free and fair elections since Kaunda left office? I certainly didn't know that. So that gap is a very, very important gap to make sure that our own people, our own businesses understand what the opportunities are on the other side, and the education that ought to go with that is very, very, very important, so that they understand they can grab the opportunities, because the opportunities are there. But people are not taking advantage because they don't know what's up there.
Sharmla, you had a comment there?
So I'm just building on what Alan's saying. Are we hungry enough?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. For me, it is that, we often think there's big ideas with big corporation. Are we actually looking at this as an opportunity to develop the bottom of the pyramid? Because if we want to actually grow as a country, we need to invest more in terms of small businesses and entrepreneurial skills. So I think the big question for me is that how do we become, hungry enough? What is the next thing that we need to actually be grappling with and actually turn that into a solution?
And as a continuation of that, Lullu, would we expect that, given the pressures that we're seeing here in South Africa, that this would be an opportunity for South African companies to increase their investments into the continent? And is that happening? And as a second part of that question, is this happening at a small and medium-sized enterprise level?
Well, to be quite honest, if we look at what most of the rest of the investment world is worried about in South Africa, yes, the politics and everything else, yes, but it's growth at the end of the day. That's their biggest concern. That's what they want to see. All of the rest they can deal with, and that is the biggest worry. So yes, South African business has been moving into Africa. We have definitely seen more activity. Some of them have burnt their fingers because they didn't necessarily think about the alignment of their own strategies and the way in which they were doing things in the rest of Africa. We're thinking sometimes, oh, we're in South Africa, we know in Africa, we know what's going on. And to Alan's point, I think a lot of the big companies actually got caught up here and there by making decisions that wasn't necessarily the right decision for the kind of market that they're in. And smaller companies have actually been more successful because they've been more agile, they've been more able to adapt, they've been more willing to change the way in which they do things. Large corporates very often, and not to take away from large corporates, but you have a specific way in which you do things, and it's slow to move and to change. We've, again, something that's been on the agenda for so long, we know that our job solution in South Africa is not with the big corporates. That's not where the jobs will be created. It will be the small and medium-sized enterprises, and it's becoming more and more difficult for big companies to survive.
Alan, I've got less than 30 seconds. If you had to give words of advice on how not to let a good crisis go to waste, how do we get it right in South Africa?
Well, one of the first things, and I think that it may sound like I'm trying to carry favor of any of you, is that the issue of gender development, in particular in South Africa, female development, is key. That's your big market. You look at the data, whether you're looking at any of the cell phone companies, you look at who's actually spending most of the money buying data for voice calls, is actually women. So we're ignoring a huge opportunity that we have in terms of this particular crisis that we have, because I do think that we still have a gender crisis where we're not bringing enough women in terms of skills, development, economic opportunities. And this one is here. It's low-hanging fruit. We can get in there. We can put a lot of money behind this thing. It's an 8-year, maybe 10-year, maybe 12-year program, but we will see the rewards much more quicker. And South Africa has that huge opportunity.
And it certainly seems that the conversation has come together around opportunities in the midst of a crisis, whether it's focusing on our institutions, the female economy, ethical leadership, and building resilience. It's been a fantastic conversation. A very big thank you to the CEO of the South African Chamber of Commerce, Alan Mukoki, economist at KPMG, Lullu Krugel, and Duke Corporate Education's Regional Managing Director responsible for Africa, Sharmla Chetty. And for you at home, thank you so much for making the time to join us once again. Remember that if you want to give me suggestions of what you'd like to see on this show, all you need to do is follow me on Twitter at @TheRealNozy or at CNBC Africa. And of course, don't forget the hashtag. It's #InvestAfrica. Until next time, it's goodbye.
Invest Africa, proudly brought to you by KPMG.